I know that God is love, but where I find it hard is that at my death, his just judgment will take over. How can a soul think only of love and mercy when that mercy is replaced with justice? And this is Paulette from New Brunswick, Canada. Thank you for that very insightful question, Paulette.
Yeah, Paulette, that is a very good question. Here's the brief answer. In our culture, we have a notion of justice that comes from Plato and Aristotle. And so when we hear the word, the Greek word dike, right, we think of the scales of justice. We think of equity. We think of, you're going to get your just deserts. And so we think of justice more or less in the fashion of equity. The Hebrew background behind dike, or which is justice, or dikaiosune, which is righteousness, or to be made righteous, is slightly, it's actually quite different. Basically, what justice is aiming at is righteousness. And what righteousness is aiming at is salvation. So the main thing to remember is not to associate justice with, the Platonic Aristotelian view, right? But rather with the Hebrew view, which is the view that's in mind, more or less, in the background of the New Testament, that justice is oriented toward bringing us to holiness, to bringing us to salvation, to bringing us to the point where we're capable of genuinely unconditional love and mercy. So God's not out there, when we die, and here comes the judgment, right? And the judgment is, okay, you did the following 4 things. I'm in the court of law, in the court of equity. And let's see, you deserve, let me add these up. And you finally, the adding machine, yeah, you are really going to get wiped out here because you got a lot of things on the list. The basic way to look at judgment and the justice of judgment is that it is leading us to holiness and readiness for salvation. It's leading us to dikaiosune. It's leading us to righteousness. Now, the main paradigm to think of, in terms of the judgment is essentially the father of the prodigal son, which I talked about in a previous episode. But remember, this boy, the father didn't give him his just deserts, right? I mean, if he had, the boy would have been annihilated because he did everything completely wrong. He abandoned his family, he shamed his family, he shamed his country in his election, spent all of his money on dissolute living, violating Torah, violating God's covenant, and then living with the pigs and becoming ritually impure. I mean, Jesus built up the story so much that the kid couldn't get any worse. I mean, if the kid got just judgment, I mean, and remember, the father in the story represents God the Father, represents Abba, right? So if he'd given him, his just deserts, that kid would have been extinguished. But in point of fact, the father is happy to have him back. And of course, once he hears the boy's imperfect contrition, that's all that's required. Father, I've sinned against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Just treat me like one of the servants. Enough. Father just lavishes him with all of these gifts because he's so overjoyed to have him back. So yes, I'd say the main thing is to get the notion of Plato and Aristotle, which is a perfectly good notion for philosophy, for courts of law, and for all kinds of other purposes, but it's not a very scriptural interpretation of the notion of just judgment, which is really oriented toward righteousness, which is oriented toward salvation, and not giving people their just deserts. But a wonderful question.